our final video on the age of exploration. We'll talk about the Columbian Exchange, the Triangle Trade, and some colonial rivalries. As the Europeans increased their international trade, rivalries developed. The amount of money at stake was enormous, and since most nations subscribed to the mercantilist idea that wealth was limited and that power came from wealth, each European country attempted to control as much trade and colonial resources as possible. In some places, like Southeast Asian countries, European powers like Portugal were displaced from trading zones by more powerful countries. In other places, conflict actually broke out within the colonies between Europeans vying for trade and economic resources. Fighting broke out between European powers in regions across the globe. Britain and France fought one another in India for control of trading ports like Madras, while in North America, violence between the French and the British culminated in the 7 Years' War. There was also conflict over territory in the Bahamas, and piracy further disrupted trade. The Columbian Exchange was the diffusion of food crops, plants, animals, people, and disease between the Americas and the Afro-Eurasian world. This represented a new degree of contact and exchange between the peoples of the world. There was enormously significant transfers that occurred once the New World had been discovered. Diffusion occurred in a variety of biological areas, including all sorts of plants and animals. People also moved, somewhat voluntarily, others involuntarily, and as Europeans came to the New World, they brought deadly diseases, like smallpox in particular, that nearly wiped out the Native American populations. You see here the wheel, the disease and the plants and animals, the migration and population shifts. The Columbian Exchange was a profoundly important consequence of the age of exploration. The contact between two worlds that had previously been isolated resulted in the diffusion of all sorts of plants, animals, goods, and people between these two formerly separate spheres. Once the initial contact had occurred, items taken back to Europe, for example, then diffused along traditional trade routes and moved throughout the Afro-Eurasian world. This list is full of recognizable items, and the diffusion of some of these goods to Europe had significant impacts. The potato, for example, came to be heavily relied on in Ireland as a basic food staple that sustained a vast majority of the population. In addition, quinine played a critical role in future imperialism in Africa as it was the treatment for malaria, which had previously kept Europeans from exploring the interior of Africa. Europe also had many things that became diffused throughout the Columbian Exchange. In addition to new crops, the introduction of certain animals played a significant role in the conquest of the Americas. The horse, for example, gave the Europeans a decided military advantage over the Native Americans and enabled them to conquer them more easily. The Columbian Exchange also involved the unintentional transfer of plants, like weeds, including the clover and the dandelion. As the Europeans conquered Native Americans, They brought diseases with them, diseases to which they had developed an immunity, but against which the Native Americans had no immunological defense. Consequently, the native population of the Americas was heavily depleted by the spread of those diseases. Perhaps the most deadly disease brought to the Americas was smallpox. European adults had developed an immunity to this disease, but Native Americans had no such defense. Consequently, these and other diseases spread throughout the Americas at a relatively quick rate and took a terrible toll on the native populations in America. In Mexico, for example, approximately 90 to 95% of the population was killed between conquest and disease. By the time Aztecs had been conquered, only 1 million or so Native Americans were left in Mexico. Some historians argue that the Europeans also brought disease to Europe from the Americas, most notably syphilis, but it did not have the same deadly impact in Europe that European diseases had in the Americas. Conquest and the Columbian Exchange both had significant impact on demography and migration. In Europe, the introduction of new foodstuffs helped facilitate a surge in population. In the Americas, the introduction of disease decimated local populations. However, the total population gradually recovered as European migration increased. Once conquest had occurred, colonization followed, fueled by a variety of goals. Europeans migrated and settled in the Americas. Colonies formed from Canada to South America. In addition to voluntary migrations, there were millions who were forced to come to the Americas. While there were some from Europe who came voluntarily as indentured servants, much of the work was done by those who had involuntarily came from Africa as slaves. For the first time, true global trade appeared. Items from all continents were now traded, and the world seemed to shrink. Broad commerce occurred, and goods diffused all over the world, even if no direct contact occurred. For example, goods from the Americas were taken to Asia by European traders so that merchants there could have access to American resources without having to travel to the New World. Hard metal, like gold and silver, from the Americas was of particular interest for the Europeans and the rest of the world. Enormous silver deposits were mined in South America, first by the Native Americans and later by slaves. This silver was brought back to Europe, particularly to Spain, to help improve its economic position in Europe and the world. This desire to accumulate silver was based on an economic theory known as bullionism, in which countries attempt to control as much hard metal as possible, since it was perceived as the strongest representation of a country's economic wealth. This concept was further developed under the economic theory of mercantilism. Mercantilism was the belief that governments should be heavily involved in promoting wealth and a favorable balance of trade by attempting to control as much capital as possible. Spain should have been the greatest holder of bullion, since much of the silver mining took place in colonies it controlled. However, Much of the silver flowed out of Spain as payment for debts or in trade, particularly with Asia. Consequently, much of the silver made its way to northern Europe and to China. One specific element of the developing global trade occurred in the Atlantic and was known as the triangular trade, or triangle trade. In this system, the Europeans traded weapons and manufactured goods with Africans in exchange for slaves. These African slaves were then forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean to work in mines and on plantations. The natural resources produced in the Americas were then shipped back to Europe, where they could be traded or turned into manufactured goods that could be used in Europe or traded. The end result of this was that the Europeans came to dominate the world's trading system. As China and Japan adopted policies of relative isolationism, Europe became the world's leading trader and power. In addition to becoming a major influence in world affairs, Europe experienced a number of changes that resulted from exploration and discovery. The Columbian Exchange changed Europe by introducing new foods and nutrition to the Europeans. In addition, Europe underwent an economic change brought about by an influx of silver from the New World that pushed prices higher across Europe. However, a growing population helped curb the impact of this inflation. For the first time, a global trade network was established that connected all parts of the world and allowed for the exchange of goods, ideas, and resources. In addition, people began to move around the globe in ways unheard of before. Exploration profoundly changed the power structure in the world and allowed European countries to rise to a position of dominance that would not be challenged for centuries. It's our final video on the age of exploration.